Thought, in its highest purpose, is the instrument of understanding, the light that illuminates reality. Yet when it becomes excessive, untampered by restraint, it turns inward like a tempest, consuming its own vessel. The mind, left unchecked, is a dangerous forge. It hammers endlessly upon itself, creating labyrinths of doubt, obsession, and self-deception. Schopenhauer long warned that overthinking is not a path to wisdom, but a descent into peril. For thought divorced from action and tempered judgment breeds illusions, self-torment, and distorted perception. When one thinks too much, the imagination begins to dominate reason. Ideas, once servants of clarity, become tyrants, dictating fears, speculations, and anxieties. One invents enemies where none exist, magnifies small slights into profound betrayals, and predicts disasters with relentless precision. The overthinking mind does not perceive reality as it is. It perceives a world distorted by the projections of its own anxieties and desires. In this state, the thinker becomes dangerous, not because he acts upon knowledge, but because he acts upon illusion, confusing shadow for substance, possibility for certainty. Worse still, overthinking can foster moral distortion. The constant analysis of motives, outcomes, and hypothetical scenarios leads one to question ethics, to doubt loyalty, to mistrust intentions. One may convince oneself that subtle manipulations or preemptive actions are justified because logic demands them. Yet this is a corruption of reason, for morality cannot be dictated by endless mental calculations. The mind, when it turns upon itself excessively, can justify cruelty in the name of foresight and oppression in the name of prudence. Such is the danger. The thinker becomes a prisoner of his intellect, and the intellect, unrestrained, becomes a weapon turned inward and outward. The overthinking individual is also a danger to himself. He suffers not because the world is cruel, but because he invents cruelty in abundance. Every possibility is a peril, every silence a threat, every uncertainty a torment. The mind generates fears and anxieties that reality does not warrant, and the sufferer becomes enslaved by his own speculations. Action becomes paralyzed, intuition silenced, and life reduced to the tyranny of unceasing rumination. Here, the thinker loses his freedom, the very freedom that thought was meant to preserve. Yet there is a further danger, subtler still, the thinker who overanalyzes others. He reads intentions, deciphers motives, predicts betrayal, and judges character with ceaseless scrutiny. But the mind cannot perceive all. It projects its own shadows onto others. In thinking too much, he becomes blind to the truth, and in his blindness, he may act destructively, harming those around him while believing he serves reason. The world, then, suffers from the tyranny of imagined logic, as the overthinking mind enforces consequences upon illusions rather than realities. The remedy is simple in principle but difficult in practice. Thought must be disciplined, imagination must be tempered by experience, reflection must be balanced with action. One must recognize that not all questions require answers, not all possibilities require contemplation, and not all perceived threats require intervention. Reason is a tool, not a master, and overthinking is a corruption of reason. Only when the mind is restrained, when reflection serves life rather than overwhelms it, does thought fulfill its noble purpose. Thus, the overthinker becomes dangerous because he is untethered from reality, morality, and action. The danger is not in intelligence, but in its unbridled excess, which transforms the mind into a forge of illusions, fear, and self-deception. Awareness of this peril is the first step toward wisdom, for thought, disciplined and tempered, illuminates life. Thought untampered consumes it. Excessive thinking has a peculiar way of betraying its own purpose. The mind, which is meant to illuminate and clarify, when left unchecked, begins to obscure reality instead of revealing it. Schopenhauer observed that thought, untampered by restraint, becomes an instrument not of understanding but of distortion. When one thinks too much, the world is no longer seen as it is. Instead, it is filtered through a lens of endless speculation, projection, and fear. The mind ceases to perceive phenomena directly, and instead, it constructs a labyrinth of imagined possibilities, hypothetical dangers, and countless what-ifs that have no basis in reality. In this sense, excessive thinking is a form of self-deception. The thinker believes he grasps the world, but he is only tracing the contours of his own imagination. When thought becomes excessive, perception itself is compromised. The overthinking mind constantly analyzes, judges, and predicts, leaving little room for experience to unfold organically. Instead of encountering reality, one encounters the interpretations of one's own speculation. A conversation is no longer a dialogue, but a series of hypotheses about intentions, meanings, and hidden motives. Every action by another is dissected for hidden implications. Every silence is weighed for significance, and every word becomes a potential source of threat. In this way, thinking, when unchecked, transforms the ordinary into the ominous, the neutral into the threatening, and the simple into the labyrinthine. The world becomes a theater of shadows and illusions, and the thinker, trapped in his own mind, mistakes these projections for truth. Excessive thinking also erodes clarity of judgment. Decisions become paralyzed by the weight of imagined consequences and improbable scenarios. The thinker attempts to calculate every variable, anticipate every response, and predict every outcome. Yet life in its complexity cannot be reduced to the calculations of the mind. By attempting to do so, the overthinker loses the ability to act decisively, to trust intuition, or to respond to circumstances with flexibility. The very faculty that should empower action, thought, becomes its opposite, a source of hesitation and inaction. Moreover, excessive thinking fosters emotional disturbance. The mind, when left to ruminate endlessly, amplifies anxiety, fear, and self-doubt. Thoughts, once servants, become tyrants, and the thinker becomes imprisoned by the scenarios his own imagination produces. Simple uncertainties grow into crises, minor challenges into existential threats. One begins to fear not the reality of the world, but the reality constructed by the mind itself, a world populated by enemies, betrayals, and disasters that exist only in thought. The danger of excessive thinking is not merely internal. It affects relationships and perception of others. The overthinker projects inner fears onto the external world, mistaking imagined intentions for actual motives. A friend's casual remark may be interpreted as criticism, a colleague's silence as hostility, a partner's hesitation as rejection. In this way, overthinking creates a reality that is more threatening and distorted than any external circumstance could produce on its own. To think excessively is to replace reality with interpretation, to mistake speculation for understanding, and to dwell in a shadow world of one's own making. The thinker becomes dangerous not only to himself, but to the relationships, choices, and opportunities he encounters. Thought, divorced from its proper role as servant to perception and action, becomes an instrument of illusion, anxiety, and moral distortion. Overthinking magnifies every shadow in the mind, turning the smallest uncertainties into towering mountains of anxiety. Schopenhauer understood that the human intellect, while capable of great insight, is equally capable of constructing imaginary catastrophes that have no basis in reality. When one constantly analyzes, predicts, and speculates, the mind begins to inflate the significance of trivial events. A minor disagreement becomes a looming conflict. A fleeting hesitation becomes evidence of betrayal, and a small mistake becomes a harbinger of inevitable failure. The overthinking mind is a factory of fear, producing anxieties not grounded in fact, but in the endless machinery of thought itself. This mental magnification of fear has profound consequences. It creates a world in which danger is omnipresent, even when no threat exists. The overthinker lives as though the universe conspires against him, seeing treachery where there is none, criticism where there is only neutrality, and threat where there is only indifference. Every action by another becomes a riddle to be solved, every word a coded message of hidden intent. In such a state, perception is dominated not by reality, but by the projection of imagined dangers onto the external world. Schopenhauer noted that the intellect, when unbridled, is like a blind guide. It moves ceaselessly, confident in its direction, yet leads only into confusion and suffering. Excessive rumination also traps one in cycles of doubt and indecision. Each imagined possibility is scrutinized, analyzed, and evaluated endlessly, so that action becomes almost impossible. The overthinker cannot act freely because he is constantly calculating consequences, weighing outcomes, and predicting reactions that may never occur. This paralysis is not merely inconvenient, it is destructive. Opportunities pass by, relationships stagnate, and life's natural flow is interrupted by the relentless machinery of thought. The intellect, intended to serve practical understanding, has become a jailer, binding the will and stifling the capacity to respond to reality with clarity and courage. Furthermore, overthinking erodes emotional stability. The mind, endlessly focused on what might go wrong, amplifies anxiety, fear, and dread. Even pleasures are tainted, as the thinker anticipates their potential loss, the judgment of others, or the unforeseen consequences that might follow. Happiness becomes a hypothetical, a state always just out of reach, because the mind cannot rest in the present. It is perpetually projecting itself into imagined future catastrophes. The individual suffers not because the world is cruel, but because he has constructed a cruel world within his own imagination. The social consequences are equally profound. Overthinking can distort perception of others, leading to suspicion, misinterpretation, and conflict. Friends, colleagues, and loved ones are no longer seen for who they are, but for the imagined intentions projected onto them by the anxious mind. Simple misunderstandings escalate into crises, minor disagreements into enduring resentments, and imagined slights become sources of deep anger. In this way, overthinking spreads its toxicity outward, creating not only personal suffering but relational disruption. In some, overthinking magnifies fear and uncertainty until they dominate life. It transforms reality into a hole of mirrors where shadows are mistaken for threats and illusions for certainty. The mind, left unchecked, becomes its own enemy, producing anxieties that enslave the will and poison relationships. Schopenhauer reminds us that this is the danger of thinking too much. It is not merely mental activity. It is a force that reshapes perception, emotion, and action into a world of constant inner and outer turmoil. Excessive thinking not only ensnares the mind in self-imposed paralysis, but also distorts perception of others, creating dangers that extend beyond the individual. Schopenhauer recognized that the intellect, when untethered from intuition and lived experience, projects the mind's own fears, insecurities, and desires onto the external world. The overthinker ceases to observe people as they are and instead interprets their actions through a prism of suspicion, anticipation, and imagined motives. A casual comment becomes criticism, a delayed response becomes hostility, and a simple disagreement becomes evidence of betrayal. In this way, the thinker's inner turbulence manifests outwardly, shaping a social reality warped by projection. The overthinker's danger lies in the assumption that others' behavior is always meaningful, intentional, and directed at him personally. Human interactions are complex and often ambiguous. Gestures, words, and actions can have multiple interpretations. Yet the overthinking mind selects only those interpretations that confirm its fears or reinforce its obsessive patterns. Schopenhauer observed that this is not a conscious act of malice, but a tragic consequence of the mind's own dominance. The thinker becomes a creator of enemies, inventing motives and conspiracies where none exist. In social contexts, this misperception can produce conflict, distrust, and isolation, as the overthinker responds to imagined threats rather than reality. Furthermore, overthinking amplifies minor flaws into perceived catastrophes. The smallest mistake by a friend, colleague, or loved one is analyzed repeatedly, dissected, and imbued with significance far beyond its true weight. One's own insecurities are projected onto others, so that their neutral behavior is interpreted as judgment, rejection, or sabotage. Over time, relationships become strained as the overthinker reacts defensively or preemptively, believing he is defending himself against real danger. In this sense, the thinker becomes dangerous to others not through intention, but through the relentless magnification of imagined threats. This projection extends into moral and social judgment as well. The overthinker scrutinizes motives, assessing loyalty, honesty, and virtue, often imagining deceit where none exists. Schopenhauer noted that the intellect, divorced from ethical intuition, can convince itself of threats and conspiracies, producing actions based on illusion rather than truth. The result is a life lived in tension, suspicion, and hyper-vigilance, where social bonds are weakened by the misperceptions of the mind. Emotionally, the thinker becomes increasingly isolated. Trust erodes because every interaction is interpreted as potentially harmful, and relationships are filtered through the lens of caution and speculation. The individual's projections are mirrored by others' responses, creating feedback loops of misunderstanding, tension, and conflict. The mind, in its obsession with predicting and controlling, generates its own social reality fraught with danger, confrontation, and disappointment. Ultimately, overthinking makes one dangerous to others because it substitutes imagined motives for actual human behavior. The mind constructs a reality of shadows, and the thinker interacts with this shadow world, responding to threats that exist only in thought. Schopenhauer's insight is clear. Intellect, unbalanced and obsessive, can distort perception of others as powerfully as it distorts perception of self. Awareness and restraint are required to prevent thought from becoming a weapon against the very world it seeks to understand. Excessive thinking becomes dangerous when it divorces the mind from lived experience, for thought divorced from reality loses its purpose and becomes an instrument of suffering. Schopenhauer emphasized that the intellect is a servant of perception and action, not a master over them. When one becomes trapped in endless analysis, the mind substitutes speculation for engagement, replacing tangible experience with hypothetical constructs. Life, in all its complexity, cannot be fully contained within thought. It is dynamic, fluid, and often unpredictable. To think without experiencing is to construct a shadow world, convincing oneself of understanding while remaining ignorant of reality itself. The overthinking mind elevates abstraction over action, analysis over intuition, and speculation over practical engagement. Decisions are filtered through layers of hypothetical scenarios, consequences, and moral calculations, each magnified and exaggerated by the machinery of thought. Meanwhile, the world proceeds, indifferent to the thinker's mental deliberations. Opportunities pass by, moments are lost, and experiences are reduced to mere objects of contemplation rather than lived reality. In this sense, the overthinker becomes a danger to himself, as he sacrifices life in pursuit of perfect understanding, a pursuit that can never be complete. Furthermore, the mind's separation from experience distorts values and priorities. The thinker may prioritize hypothetical threats or imagined consequences over tangible needs and actual relationships. Social interactions are dissected endlessly. Emotional experiences are evaluated as if they were problems to solve, and personal desires are analyzed to the point of paralysis. Schopenhauer observed that this imbalance produces a profound disconnection between intellect and will. The mind knows much but acts little, and the individual drifts through life as a spectator of his own existence rather than a participant. The danger of thought divorced from experience extends to creativity, morality, and personal growth. Imagination, when untampered by engagement, spins endlessly, generating possibilities that may never be realized, ideals that cannot be embodied, and judgments that lack grounding. Ethical reasoning becomes abstract and theoretical, no longer tied to the consequences of actions in real life. Insight, instead of illuminating the path, becomes an obstacle to genuine understanding. Knowledge accumulated without context or application is sterile and even corrosive, leading to frustration, despair, or misguided attempts at control. In social contexts, overthinking produces misunderstanding and conflict. The thinker interprets actions and intentions through the lens of hypothetical scenarios rather than observation, responding to shadows instead of substance. Relationships falter as one reacts to imagined threats and misperceived motives, while genuine connection is overlooked. Schopenhauer warned that intellect without grounding in reality can transform perception into distortion and thought into a form of subtle tyranny over oneself and over others. Ultimately, thought divorced from experience is self-defeating. The intellect, designed to navigate, understand, and respond to reality, becomes a prison when it operates without engagement. The overthinker substitutes speculation for understanding, imagining the world rather than encountering it. Life, which is meant to be acted upon, is reduced to a series of mental constructions, and the thinker becomes both victim and agent of his own suffering. True wisdom, Schopenhauer teaches, lies in balancing reflection with experience, thought with action, and analysis with lived reality. The remedy to the dangers of overthinking lies in cultivating disciplined thought, balancing reflection with action, and tempering imagination with reality. Schopenhauer emphasized that intellect, when left unchecked, becomes a source of suffering, yet when properly guided, it is the instrument of clarity, insight, and self-mastery. The excessive thinker must learn to recognize the limits of speculation, distinguishing between useful analysis and destructive rumination. Not every question requires exhaustive contemplation, not every hypothetical scenario demands exhaustive calculation, and not every uncertainty warrants constant vigilance. By understanding these limits, one can redirect the mind toward thought that serves life rather than enslaves it. Discipline of thought begins with awareness. The individual must observe the patterns of overthinking without judgment, noting when the mind spirals into unnecessary speculation or magnifies trivial uncertainties. Schopenhauer noted that awareness alone can interrupt the cycle of obsessive reflection, providing the first step toward liberation. Once one recognizes the tendency to overanalyze, one can consciously choose to disengage from thoughts that are unproductive or harmful. This does not mean abandoning reasoning or critical thinking, but rather exercising discernment in its application. Thought becomes a servant of understanding, not a tyrant over perception or action. Action is the counterbalance to reflection. Excessive thinking immobilizes the will, trapping the individual in a labyrinth of hypothetical outcomes. To restore harmony, thought must be integrated with deliberate action. Each decision, no matter how small, becomes an opportunity to ground intellect in reality, testing hypotheses against experience rather than imagination. Through action, the mind receives feedback from the world, learning the difference between real consequences and imagined dangers. Schopenhauer emphasized that wisdom is not merely theoretical knowledge. It is the capacity to navigate life effectively, which requires the interplay of reflection and engagement. Temperance of imagination is equally crucial. The intellect, when untethered from experience, tends to exaggerate fears, inflate possibilities, and project internal anxieties onto external reality. By cultivating awareness of these tendencies, one can prevent thought from creating shadows that distort perception. The overthinker learns to distinguish between plausible outcomes and improbable fantasies, between real threats and imagined dangers. Thought becomes precise, calibrated, and grounded, illuminating reality rather than obscuring it. Furthermore, disciplined thought fosters emotional stability. When the mind ceases to inflate threats and magnify uncertainties, anxiety diminishes, confidence increases, and clarity of judgment is restored. The thinker learns to trust both intellect and intuition, balancing careful analysis with responsiveness to circumstances as they unfold. Socially, this balance reduces misunderstanding, strengthens relationships, and aligns perception with reality, mitigating the external consequences of overthinking. Ultimately, the overthinking mind transforms from a source of danger into a source of insight and strength. Schopenhauer teaches that disciplined thought, harmonized with action and grounded in experience, allows intellect to illuminate life rather than enslave it. The excessive thinker, once aware and disciplined, can navigate the world with clarity, act decisively, and perceive others accurately. Thought becomes a tool of liberation rather than a generator of fear, paralysis, and distortion, fulfilling its true purpose as the instrument of wisdom,